Because we're in the teaching. Okay.
Okay, brilliant. So welcome everyone to another installment of our UCL Birkbeck IEPS Friday Seminar Series. This week, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Luca Caricchi from the University of Geneva. Luca uses experimental data, but also machine learning to understand the physical mechanisms responsible for the transfer and emplacement of magma in the Earth's crust and its eruption on the surface. And today, Luca is going to be talking to us about unveiling the architecture of volcanic plumbing systems using machine learning, thermobarometry, and chemometry. So I will now pass you over to Luca to explain more.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks for having me. It's always nice to share this research. So as anything we do, you can see here there are a lot of names. So this is people from my group and a collaborator from the University of Perugia, where I come from, where I studied. And so today I would like to share with you some recent developments, some research we are doing on applying machine learning to thermobarometry, and I will try to show you why we look for another method to do thermobarometry. Okay, so yes. Okay, so the first reason, I mean, why do we care about thermobarometry? And as you all know, one issue we have with observing volcanic processes is that direct observation is impossible. We don't manage, or almost impossible, to see what is below. So we use two sets of methods. One is geophysics. We have a variety of techniques to try to understand what is below active volcanic systems. And another approach that we as petrologists use is thermobarometry. So thermobarometry is trying to use the chemistry of minerals to understand their pressure and temperature of crystallization. So if we understand these, we can understand something about the distribution of pressure where magma stops and perhaps fractionates and stall before a volcanic eruption. So there is a number of things that have been done recently, and we will see that there is a tendency still to speak about storage depth. So where was the magma stored before eruption? And we can see diagrams like this one where we have distribution of pressures, and now the way we interpret this distribution of pressure is very much fundamental to our understanding and of volcanic plumbing systems. So if we interpret this spread in pressure as just an uncertainty on our estimates, we could think that we have one storage depth that is perhaps the mode or the median of this curve, and then the rest is noise. Another way to interpret this instead is that there is a distribution of probability of finding magma in the crust, and this changed totally the way we see the magmatic system, as I will show later. So this is a summary of what I was saying. You can imagine a system like the one on the left. If you think that the excess scatter around the mode and the median is just due to uncertainty or perhaps some accidental crystals that have been picked up while the magma was ascending, you can imagine a system with one magma chamber and then some distribution around it. However, if we look at models, models, these are really sketches for the moment, but if we look at what we think is present below active volcanoes, we start to see this sort of sketches here, or ideal models where magma is distributed throughout the crust. And in this case, then you could imagine that this curve here could tell us something about the distribution of magmas. However, one thing you see from these sketches is that there should be more magma at depth than at the surface. And this will make sense. Magma can stay even longer time in the lower crust, present as a partially molten material with respect to the upper crust, simply because down here the loss of heat is lower. So the probability of finding magma down here should be much higher than up here. But typically we find distribution like this one. So there must be some sort of bias in the sampling of volcanic products. And this is something we need to discuss. And a corollary to this discussion is also that to understand if we can trust these tails of higher pressure, we need to be able to estimate the error for each single analysis we do. We cannot use a common error for all of them. Otherwise, this could complicate the interpretation, because if you have very large errors and everything here is within error, there is no reason to think that there is distribution of magma. On the other hand, if you have very good analysis down here, then we can trust with some confidence that there should be magma down here. Now, this discussion about to understand what the potential distribution of error and the associated errors with thermobarometry, we need to look at the calibration data set we normally use. So this is a classic one. This is the lab data set. This is what MELS is based on. And in this specific case, I'm just showing you pressure and temperature of all the experiments that have been performed for which clinopyroxene is stable. That is the phase we are going to use today to look at this problematic. And you can see that there is quite a range of pressure and temperature, and a range of composition. So you see how experiments perform at higher pressure, they perform at higher temperature. This is simply because the temperature of liquidus of magma increases with pressure. So if we want to have a partially molten system, we must increase the temperature. Now, and also you can see that the experiments at higher temperature, of course, are performed on magmas that are more mafic with respect to the experiments that are performed at similar pressure but lower temperature. So we need to think about this, because this could lead to biases in our estimates, because you see that pressure and temperature are somewhat related. So in principle, we could, if we observe an increase of temperature with depth, we must wonder if this is a problem of our calibration data set, or it's actually a true feature. So normally, what do? We make some assumption, and the assumption, the strongest one, is that so the experiments must be at equilibrium. Then we assume that the end members that we consider being related to pressure in this case, but also temperature, are pure. And then we fit the experiments essentially, and we find some relationship between the pressure and the composition of a mineral, in this case pyroxene. And you can see that it's not only the mineral. A lot of time there are some parameters here that depend on the composition of the melt. And this is to try to account for the fact that the composition of a mineral is not only controlled by pressure or temperature, but is also controlled by the composition of the magma from which the pyroxene crystallizes. So we do this, and so this entails a number of uncertainties, of course, including the fact that you must be sure that this liquid is the liquid in equilibrium with the specific portion of the mineral you are analyzing and from which you want to get a pressure estimate. So this is a little bit why we went into machine learning. We try to make the smallest possible amount of assumption, and the smallest number of assumption in this case is no initial assumption. And you will see later why I put this picture of this big book. The approach we use is called random forest. It is one of the most understandable machine learning algorithm that exists, just because we can understand a bit what is going on. It's not a black box. But what does it do? Essentially, imagine this is a book that contains all the experiments ever performed in the literature. And what machine learning is doing, so what random forest is doing, is flipping through the pages of this book and finding the composition that is the closest possible to our analysis. And I said, okay, this experiment was performed at this pressure, so this must be the pressure. This is the basic principle. It's a little bit more complicated, but not much. So why random forest? Because we tried in an initial publication with Maurizio Petrelli, and we saw that it was the one that was performing the best. So there is not much to add to this. There are a bunch of other different algorithms that could be used, but this was the one performing the best. So what does it do is a random forest we will see is an ensemble of decision trees. So decision trees is really the most fundamental, the most basic piece of machine learning algorithm. So it's essentially a tree that asks question. So you have an analysis, and the tree says, okay, the aluminum content is smaller or larger than this value, and then if it's larger, you go this way, and then you use another element, and then you keep using element until you find the experiment that is the closest possible, and this outputs a temperature. So now the decision tree are very simple, but are also very imprecise. So this is why you need a forest. So, and a forest is built, and you can see that these trees are all different. So the secret of the forest is to have the most diverse possible forest of decision trees. And the reason, so to create diversity, what is done is that instead of considering all the elements, every time that you start a tree, you consider a different subset of all the elements that are contained in pyroxene. And by doing this, you come up with a very large variety of trees. This is done at each split, so selecting another subset and another subset. So this generates a variety of trees. And you can imagine that all these trees behave a little bit like a crowd that is trying to estimate how many candies are in this bowl. And you know this experiment, the wisdom of the crowd. Each single person is very bad at estimating how many candies are inside this bowl, but if you put all the data together, the mean estimate is pretty close to the number of candies inside this bowl here. So the random forest is doing a very similar thing. So to show you that that this is sort of true, this is a diagram I made actually this morning. So what I plot here is this is the pressure and temperature at which each experiment is performed, where there is pyroxene. And then this diamond here is the estimated pressure and temperature that we get out of the random forest. And these are the color contouring is the residuals. So I'm basically looking inside the book of experiments with one composition and saying, what is the most similar composition to my pyroxene? And you see red are low residuals. So the yellow point should be where the graph is the most red. And this is the case in this case, and it's the case here. You can see how the red, of course, there is the red is not a spot, and this we will see later controls the degree of confidence with which we can estimate pressure and temperature. But in general terms, this is what it seems to work okay. So in reality, what do you get? You have, say, normally we work with some few hundred trees. And what you get is that each tree gives you an estimate. And then this will be the distribution of the estimate of pressure for all the trees. And normally what random forest does when it works in regression mode is to select the mean pressure. So this is fine where you have distribution that are normal, but in many, many cases, the distribution are actually non-normal of the estimated pressure. So we need to think about that. So at the beginning, we were using the mean distribution, that was the mean of the distribution. But rapidly we realize, look at this case, for example, you have some estimates that are really, really high with respect to the true value that is the black curve. So if you use the mean, the algorithm was overestimating the pressure of crystallization of the pyroxene. So to cut the story short, what we do now, we use the median because it's less sensitive to very bad estimates. This is the reason we use this. So now another bias that I didn't mention before is that also you see how many more experiments are performed at low pressure with respect to high pressure, and this is due to the fact that it's much easier to perform an experiment at 1 atmosphere inside a furnace than to perform an experiment at 30 kilobar and 1600 degrees inside a multi-anvil apparatus, for example. So this means also is something we need to think about. Normally, machine learning is very sensitive to this sort of heterogeneity. So you will tend to get underestimate of pressure because there are many more experiments. This is true for regression. If you do any sort of regression, this is a problem too. Actually, what we are realizing more and more is the random forest, and this is known in the literature as well, is not that sensitive to this sort of heterogeneity. So we tried a couple of approaches to remove this heterogeneity of data. We tried some data augmentation, but we didn't notice any significant difference. So this means we just include all the calibration experiments. We did some work. This is my student Corinne Jorgensen with other PhD students. They went through the process of doing the hyperparameter tuning. So this is adjusting all the little knobs that a random forest contain to see if the performance could be improved. So you try to maximize the performance. In general, we see that what is very important is the number of features, that is this parameter here. So how many elements do we use to split each little branch of the trees? And when you are above 5, is fine. So you tend not to improve anymore. And other parameters don't change much at all. Liquid or not liquid, that was an essential point, because in principle we don't want to use the liquid. And the reason not to use the liquid is that you may introduce another uncertainty, that is that you need to be sure that the liquid is in equilibrium with the pyroxene. Now, the tests that have been performed here show that if you take the standard error of the estimate of the R square, there is not much difference, or not a statistically significant difference between using only pyroxene or couples of pyroxene and liquid. So this is good, because then we can just use the pyroxene without having to find the best matching liquid. Performance, we tried also to subset the experiments. So this is an attempt to remove the heterogeneity in the distribution of pressure you have in the calibration dataset. And you can see again, there is no difference. So if you remove all the experiments, for example, perform at 1 atmosphere, there is not much difference. So again, then we can leave all the experiments. We think this is related to the fact that it's a little bit like if you try to recognize an animal, it's very useful to know many animals, even if they are very different. You know, if you try to identify an elephant and you know only dogs, it may be complicated. But if you know all the animals in the world, you have better chance to immediately recognize an elephant from a dog. And this is the reason why many experiments that are there that are very different, they just serve for the algorithm to faster find the best matching solution. We tried also to filter for composition. Also, I don't want to dwell too much, not much advantage. So the performance is similar, and therefore we don't filter for composition in general. The problem here is that if you start to filter for composition, the total amount of experiments you can rely on to calibrate your algorithm drops as well. So there is an optimum here between the number of experiments and how close they are to your composition. Again, because we don't notice much of a difference, we prefer to keep it broad. Plus, there is another problem that when you use parameter like R square, you can have very high R square value, but the problem here is that you are comparing apple and pears, because if R square is very large, but you have very few points, it may be just it's very large just because you have few points, but if you use more points, R will generally decrease, sorry. So again, it's a little bit tricky to estimate what the performance on an algorithm is. And now I'll show you how we do this. The biggest source of uncertainty is actually what we choose as our test dataset. So in machine learning, the first thing to do is to split the dataset into a train dataset that is only used to train the algorithm. And then there is a portion of the dataset that is not used for training. That is the one on which the algorithm is going to be tested. So it's very fundamental, this step, because if we include them, one of the problems we get is called overfitting. So, and this means that we are very good at finding the pressure for things we know, but we have no idea how good we are at estimating things for things we don't know. So the way we split the data set is by taking 20% typically of the data set, but not in a random way. We select an homogeneous distribution of pressure and temperature of which the experiments were performed, and we extract, I don't know, say 100 experiments out of 2,000, of 500 or whatever it is, or 1,000. And then we repeat this procedure, because every time what we see that if we have a specific algorithm, we don't get one value of standard error estimate. So at each, depending on what we extract, we get different values. And this is, of course, function of which experiments get extracted. So if you extract a lot of experiments that are very close to the analysis of the pyroxene we are looking for, then the performance of the algorithm drops. So we need to be careful, and this is a fairer way, if you want to express the uncertainty. That is not one value; it's actually a distribution of values, both for R square and the standard error of the estimate. So the way we actually do it, we don't use standard error of the estimate or R square. We actually look at the distributions we get from our forest. You were seeing before that there were some distributions that were much broader than others that were very tight. So obviously, if a distribution is very tight around the mean, this means that the confidence with which we can use that estimate is much larger with respect to a distribution that is very large. Because if the distribution is very large, it's essentially our algorithm has not much of a clue where to put our pressure. So what we do, we use the interquartile ranges. So if this is an estimate, for example, is the between the true pressure and the estimated pressure for a test data set, and you see there is some scatter, but within the error they fit. Now here what we do is to exclude all the estimates where the interquartile range is larger than 5 kilobar. So essentially what we are saying is the algorithm doesn't know much about this, so we may as well remove them, and we just consider all estimates that have a very small or smaller interquartile range of the estimated pressure. And you see that there are some points that don't fit. This is clear. We will always have this, but in general, the fit is relatively good. So some thoughts about this. Normally, a lot of time when we do pressure thermobarometry, we find relationship between P and T. And it doesn't need to be a bias, but I always wonder if this relationship is actually a product of the fact that I was telling you before, there is pressure and temperature are not independent variables in the calibration data set we use. So we need to think about this. It could be an issue. And now I want to spend a little time here. This is a bit of a complicated diagram, but imagine you have a magma, and this is the solidus temperature, and this is the liquidus temperature. So you see, this is a magma that contains some water, and this is the depth of saturation. So when the magma is water undersaturated, the liquidus temperature of this magma increases with depth. A shallower depth than saturation, the liquidus temperature increases with decreasing pressure. And this is because the magma loses water and then crystallizes. So now let's imagine that we have a magma that comes from the mantle and is by definition at its liquidus temperature. So it's here. If it's ascending adiabatically, this magma cannot crystallize until it reaches this point here. So at this point, it will crystallize. Now, what we should observe is a magma that has the characteristic of a mantle, of a magma in equilibrium with the mantle, so high magnesium content, high chromium content, but it will record a low pressure. And I'm making this example because I will show you later. This is what we were very puzzled, so we thought our algorithm were not working at all. Then we can go a little bit further. Imagine our magma producing the mantle arrives at the base of the crust and for some reason stalls there and it starts to cool. So if it starts to cool, it will crystallize, say, some pyroxene. So in this case, we could have a record of this pressure. Now this pyroxene is here, maybe another pulse of magma comes up and it brings this pyroxene up. Now the problem is that this pyroxene has very small probability of surviving, because if I draw another adiabatic ascent path, this pyroxene will be included in a magma that becomes essentially overheated. So the probability of resorbing this pyroxene is very high. So the probability of preserving record of this pressure and temperature down here is quite small. And the same discussion applies to melt inclusions. So this is why I think there are very few melt inclusions that record high content of CO2, for example. This could be a way to, something to think about, okay? Now, if we go in the middle of the distribution, the probability of surviving for this crystal increases, because even if I draw an ascent path, there is no overheating. So the rate of resorption, even if it's there, is much smaller with respect to pyroxene that go from this region here. Now, then you see that my probability, this is drawn by hand, there is no data. But you see that my probability of preserving this thing drops again. And this is why I draw this line that tell us where magma is more than 50% crystals. So we know that the mobility of magma drops when the crystallinity is too high. So also these ones have very low probability of being preserved in terms of pressure and temperature estimates, simply because it's difficult to mobilize these crystals. So the larger probability is to find something up here. And then you see that the probability is a sort of vertical, so it's a constant temperature and a range of pressures that we should observe if magma is present throughout the crust. So it's a bit of a different configuration with respect to the increase of pressure and temperature we see in some thermobarometers. So the first case study I want to present is Colli Albani. So Colli Albani is a volcano near Rome. So this is Rome, and the pyroclastic flow of this volcano here enter inside Rome. So it's a rather problematic system, and it's active. So there is magma down there somewhere. It's a very interesting volcano because it has very low silica content, very high potassium, so very low viscosity, but it does very large ignimbrites and repeatedly. So we were, with my student Corinne Jorgensen, we were looking at this, and we did some thermobarometry together also with Monica Agreda Lopez, that I hope is in the audience. She is now in Perugia doing a PhD. She was a master with us. This actually these data are from Monica. So this is an eruption that starts with a fault deposit that we call Villa Seni 0. And then there is a large package of pyroclastic density current. And these are the data we obtain. And this is when we thought that the algorithm wouldn't work at all. So what we find is that the highest pressure are recorded by so the highest pressure are associated with the lowest temperature. And then we have another blob of data, if you want, here, and they are contoured for different things. So these are the units. So you see that the deepest units, the deepest samples, the pyroxene recording the highest pressure and the lowest temperature, really, are the ones that are erupted first. And then we get the big body of the ignimbrite that erupts a variety of pyroxene. But if you look, this is contoured for chromium, and this is contoured for magnesium. So what we find is that we have a range between 2 and 4 kilobar, where we get pyroxene with magnesium number up to 96, and chromium content up to 1% that record low pressure. And this, I think, is due to the things I was showing before, that is this variation of liquid as function of pressure. So the probability of preserving high pressure pyroxene is only high when they are a low temperature. So these are antecrystal of some cumulate material that crystallized at the base of the crust. While I would argue that the high magnesium, high chromium is the magma that was triggering the eruption. So this is the magma coming from that and then eventually carrying up this low temperature pyroxene and producing the caldera collapse. So to be sure about this, we did some modeling. So we did some, it's 1D thermal modeling, but and we inject magma in the crust for a few million years, randomly at all depths. And this is the figure you come out with after a few million years. And what is striking is that there is almost no variation of temperature between 25 and 10 kilometers. And this is because we have injected so much sensible heat into the crust that the initial geotherm has essentially no impact on the distribution of temperature. So this will confirm that in general, if we have a transcrustal magmatic zone, the manifestation of that should be a vertical line of pressure and temperature estimates. So a second case study is St. Kitts in the Lesser Antilles, and this is a sequence that was studied by Oliver Higgins, that is a PhD in our group. So he did also a very large number of tests. He was looking if using cations instead of oxides was better or not, and we didn't see any difference also in this case. And then importantly, he built a chemometer. So it's the same principle of the thermobarometry, but you use the composition of the pyroxene to tell you something about the composition of the magma, of the melt from which the pyroxene crystallized. So these are the data I found. Again, also in this case, you start to see these relatively vertical trends for the pressure and temperature estimates. You see also nicely the transition from CPX to amphibole that records lower temperature here. And then he studied the evolution over the stratigraphy. And what he finds is that there is, in general, a little increase of the depth from which these magma are sourced. They are not sourced from one depth, they are formed from a range of depths. So we will argue also in this case, what we are looking at is a system that is where magma is distributed throughout the crust, that interestingly finds a progressive increase of temperature throughout the stratigraphy. And this manifests in a variation, not of the bulk rock composition, but a variation of the matrix glass and the composition of the matrix plagioclase. So it looks like the bulk rock composition is a bit of a minestrone rock that with a lot of antecrust inside, buffering the composition of the bulk rock, but the melt and the plagioclase record this variation that is also recorded by the temperature estimate we obtained from pyroxene. The chemometry is interesting. We get, so it's a very busy diagram. There are a lot of data, but you see the square outline of pyroxene. So this means our liquid composition or melt composition recalculated starting from a cline of pyroxene. The circles are amphibole, and these are the ore rock composition for this. And you can see that they describe two sort of parallel trends, and the ore rock composition is in between. And this is interesting. Okay, yep. Did I move? No. This is interesting because we can see that, in fact, this is the composition of this rock. There are a lot of andesite, but the pyroxene and the amphibole also record a lot of andesite. This is something we are still working on, but there is a lot of discussion, as you may know, about the fact that there may be not many andesite liquids inside volcanic system. This does not seem to be the same perspective from the crystal point of view. Now I want to put two case studies. Sorry, I put a bonus one. I was tempted, but this one is a beautiful study on an eruption of Mayotte, an underwater eruption. And I just took it because it's beautiful data, and I want to look what they give. So in these diagrams, I use again pyroxene to estimate pressure and temperature, and this is what we observe. We have some deep storage, not much in between, and then we have some shallow storage. And these diagrams are color contour for silica content, sodium content, and magnesium content. And the thing I find fantastic is, I don't know, I find it fantastic, but maybe you don't. You have very high, I mean, very high for these rocks. This is about 60% silica at 13 kilobar depth. So this is well inside the lithosphere in this place. The crust is finishing about here. So we are in the mantle here, in the lithospheric mantle, and we have very evolved rocks. Then we have a second set of points at here, low pressure, nothing in between. So what I did is to calculate the liquidus. These are calculated, it's not drawn with Illustrator. So I did the calculation with rhyolite maths, and this is the liquidus for these magmas of this composition. And now what I find interesting is that there is nothing here, and there is nothing here, but there is some estimates here. And if you look at them, these magmas here contain a very high magnesium magmas. So these are primitive. So I will argue that this is where magma was stored, but these ones represent the magma that come from, they are in equilibrium with the mantle, they come up along an adiabatic ascent, and they intercept the liquidus at shallower depth, and this is why we get these two tier system. Is there magma in between? I don't know, probably not, because I would expect at least some antechrist or xenochrist to record this pressure. So maybe it's really a two-tier system where the magma is transferred very rapidly from the mantle to eruption. And these are the composition recalculated, plotted in a diagram where I report all the, I had to report Canary Islands because for Mayotte, unfortunately, we don't have many data. But you see, these are not crazy liquids. So are liquids that are in agreement with some rocks that were erupted in a similar geodynamic context. Now, what I find interesting is also that in this, the interpretation of this eruption was that the evolved rocks were magma that was coming from depth that intercepted a lens of magma a shallower depth. That was the case also for Bardarbunga all around. And actually, if I look at this data, I'm wondering if actually this evolved melt came directly from the lithosphere. It's just, this is speculation. And I wonder if this very evolved melt don't form like in a way like Sebastian Pillet is discussing, where you have these percolating veins in the lithosphere and you are able to generate very evolved melts down there. Maybe these evolved melt were some of these residual melt forming these metasomatic veins in the lithosphere. So this, I put this bonus slide, and then I will rapidly go to the end. I see I have about 5 minutes. So this is the 1971 eruption of Teneguia that is in La Palma. This is very similar to the eruption that is ongoing now in La Palma. And here we find similar things. We also find melts that are very evolved. So red means more silica and low chromium. And then we find high chromium and high magnesium at shallow depth. So I think this is a similar configuration or a similar set to what we have seen from Mayotte. In this case, there is a bit more distributed pressure. We have some preliminary data from La Palma. I didn't show it because we don't have yet enough. But what we are recording for what we have is only the shallow part. So we still don't see these deep melts. And I'm wondering if we will see them perhaps when the eruption is approaching an end. The last one is Galapagos. I will go fast on this, but Galapagos was, this is a nice paper from Stock and others. And what they show was using plagioclase is that these two volcanoes, for instance, erupt a lot of rocks of this composition, but not much on this side of the diagram. And this is a similar compilation I took from Stock and GeoRock. You see that most of the rock have almost a constant composition, and then there is much less evolved material on the left. So the argument in their paper, so the argument in their paper is they use plagioclase, and they say, actually the plagioclase record the presence of evolved melt throughout the plun system, but we don't see it as a bulk rock because there is so much mafic magma that is passing through the system that overwhelms the signal of these rocks. And so we decided to apply our chemometer to see if we can see the same, and we see the same. So these points here are also recording, and actually it's interesting because the mineral seems to record much, much more of this material respect to actually what is erupted at the surface. And my feeling is that because this magma don't contain a lot of water, is that the minerals cannot record the deepest and hottest portion of the system simply because by decompressing, the minerals are resorbing. So there is no record of this stuff. On the other hand, we see a record that is very similar to the estimates of Stock and others. So yes, there seems to be evolved magma throughout the plumbing system at Galapagos. Where are we going with this? We are now working in 2D. This is, we think, is fundamental. So we do maps of temperature and pressure, you will see later. And this is done because the textural context is fundamental. So sometimes you have seen, I mean, this thing as any other approach just don't work. And because they don't work, you have an example here. You see, here you have a core that records some high pressure. And then we see that the pressure seems to drop, and then it increases again. So it will take a very complicated dynamic to explain these things. And what we think is actually happening is that here there was some reaction with some melts that were percolating through the system that produced this lower pressure. And actually this composition here, you see it is, has been partially resorbed, and then there is some overgrowth. And we wonder if this is just a kinetic effect. So the rate of growth can control the composition of minerals, and maybe this then affects our estimates. So the textural context is very important. Second reason why working on maps on hundreds of thousands of points is important is because of this graph here. If you look, the field spots are for amphibole and CPX, and these are estimates obtained by taking an operator. You go to the microprobe and you start to shoot points where you think is interesting. What you see, you almost record a very small range of pressure. If you take the maps, you see the deepest portion of the system emerging. And this is probably because a lot of the textural complexity in the rocks is generated at shallow depth. So if we, and us as petrologists, we are interested in this complexity. So we spend a long time measuring them, but then we lose perhaps much more boring looking things that give much more information about the deepest portion of the system. So we think this is the next step, or we are taking this next step. So machine learning offers an alternative or actually a complementary approach to classic thermodynamic-based thermobarometers. The models are generalizable, so you can use it for any composition, really. And we can provide an uncertainty for every single analysis. And we think this is also very important. And we see, at least in the system we have studied, in a couple of them, not in Mayotte and not in La Palma, that system seem to have this transcrustal nature where magma is distributed over a large range of depths. And I leave you with some reference. This is some recent publication from my students, and the original one from Maurizio Petrelli, on which all this is based. So thank you very much for listening. Done.
Hello, thank you very much for that. Oh, Andy's clapping. I guess we could do a real life clap as well.
Thank you very much. This is refreshing.
Yeah, exactly. Are there any questions from in the room? Yep.
Yeah, there's an assumption at the beginning there of these crystal melts getting to equilibrium. Is that, how bad is that, given the timescales of kinetics?
Did you hear that?
So if I understood correctly, it's about how bad is the assumption that the liquid and the pyroxene are at equilibrium,
Yeah.
given. So I think they are at equilibrium. We have enough time to make them re-equilibrate. The problem is, in a rock, which liquid do we choose? So for instance, if we have a pyroxene that contains a melt inclusion, in that case, we can take the pyroxene next to the melt inclusion and make the assumption that these two were in equilibrium. So this could be used for the thermobarometry. The problem is, if we don't have melt inclusion, how do we find the liquid that was in equilibrium with the core of this crystal? So either we don't use that information, or we only use the rim of the pyroxene that is in contact with the matrix glass, and then we can assume that they were in equilibrium. But otherwise, we have always to make an assumption of which melt was in equilibrium with which portion of the crystal. So it was not linked to the lack of equilibrium. It was more linked to the fact that it's difficult to identify which one is the correct one in terms of liquid composition.
Okay. Any other questions from the room? Any questions from people on Zoom? Andy's got a high, is that a high five or question?
My Zoom hand. Thanks, Luca.
Hi, Andy.
So I guess I wondered, so you're using an experimental database to calibrate your barometer, thermobarometer, and that's presumably following the liquidus of, or mostly following the liquidus temperature of their various compositions. So I mean, does it really cover the full diversity of compositions we expect for all lavas across the crust, considering crustal temperatures are probably lower than most of these experiments that have been done? So I understand that machine learning is really good at interpolation, but quite a lot of the temperatures you're predicting are lower, or at the lower end of these. So you're really extrapolating with machine learning. Now, how robust is that process?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually, because this is not the entire data set. This is LEPRO. Plus to this, we add any experiment that was performed over the last 11 years. So from 2010 is the last experiment. So we do have experiments at low temperature. Otherwise, we just couldn't. So there is no extrapolation in machine learning. So this algorithm only know what it exists. So what this means, if you get an estimate at 800 degrees, there must be at least one experiment at 800 degrees. Otherwise, it wouldn't give it to you. So for example, in other words, if I cut the data set and I input only data above 1 gigapascal, I just cannot obtain anything below the 1 gigapascal because it's just comparing with what he knows. And sorry, this is not a correct diagram. It was so the one we use for calibration contains also experiment at low pressure and a low temperature and a variety of pressure. Sorry, yeah, you're right.
Okay.
Did I answer to your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question was really how much are you hand-tied by the experiments that are there?
A lot. I mean, it would be great to have a lot of experiments. So you see, for example, this is the correct data set, in fact. You see that here, there are experiments performed at between 10 and 20 kilobar at temperature down to 800 degrees. And you see what is happening, that there is always a scatter of the residual. So the composition that is the closest to our pyroxene is somewhere here. But if we will have more and more experiments, that would be fantastic. So if you can perform, okay, let me rephrase this. If this is no substitute for good experiments. So if you go to La Palma, you take the composition of La Palma and you are able to reproduce exactly the composition of the pyroxene you observe, this will always be better than what we are doing, simply because, you know, you can nail really precisely. So if you're able to synthesize exactly the same pyroxene.
But if you synthesize exactly the same, that's one way of producing that composition. But that doesn't rule out the fact that there may be a non-unique solution to that composition. So
we take in account this. So I'm happy to do that. In an experiment, obviously you have limitation, but if you could do experiments in all range, that would be fantastic. Yeah, the algorithm will only improve because it would know more of this. So I think, as anything in the earth sciences, we need to work together to find the best possible solution. Yeah. There is no
cool. Thank you.
Gun. Yeah.
Okay, John, do you want to ask your question or you type in it? Okay, great.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to ask, I mean, the traditional way to do this presumably is, I think you sort of showed an example, is to fit it to some sort of model, right? To fit it to some sort of thermodynamic model. I mean, if you knew the free energy of the melts properly and you had a mixing model and so on, what you're saying is that doesn't work. I mean, so are we, so I guess my question is, should we sort of give up thermodynamics?
No. Au contraire. Excellent question. So we hope that in future we can use this approach together with thermodynamics. So to use this approach to retrieve thermodynamic parameters and then build a thermodynamic model. So the problem, I'm not saying it's not working. The problem is that assuming that the purity of the end member and considering only some end member, for example, if you consider only the jadeite end member, obviously we are making a big assumption. And these pyroxene are complicated because they have a different amount of composition. So I don't know how to do it yet. We are discussing with some people that knows much more than me about machine learning. But the idea would be to use this together with the thermodynamic modeling to constrain the thermodynamic parameters. That would be ideal. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you also, sort of perhaps related to that, because you also said that you get an error for individual experiments, which is presumably above and beyond the error that's ever reported experimentally. And so that also felt kind of powerful, that you could then give new error bars to everything and go back and when you refit it to, say, some thermodynamic model.
Yes, so I wanted to show you an example when I realized that I told you a lot of this and then I didn't show it. So perhaps I take another video where I show you this. No, I did one. In one example, there were error bars. Sorry, pardon me for this. So you see these gray lines. I don't know if they're very visible.
Oh, yeah.
So these gray lines is the interquartile range. So we take it's a certain confidence. So here, there are some points that had uncertainty. They were like 15 kilobar. So the interquartile range was so large that we just excluded them because we don't get information out of that. Essentially, our algorithm is saying, I have no idea. so we can put it there, but we are not confident about the estimate of pressure and temperature. So as you were saying, I think this is very powerful because if we look at these points, we have no idea if they're really at 16 kilobar or 10. But what we have an idea is that there are two groups of data, one deep, one shallow. If we use instead a general expression of the uncertainty, like the standard error of the estimate, it's unfair because, I will argue, because especially for the high pressure, and I go back, no, here. So the uncertainty when we do a regression cannot be the same for portion of the experimental calibration data set where there are many few data respect to portion where there are many more data. It cannot just be the same. So it's an unfair, I think, underestimate of the error, especially for the high pressure estimates. So we like this thing of it's not a true error. It's really an uncertainty. It expresses the uncertainty of the forest in determining any value of PNT.
So you can do that for the original experiments, I'm assuming, right? Can you also do? I mean, you could go back and say, put an error. I mean, or is that too circular?
We do the same. We can do the same with the test data set.
Yeah,
so for
exactly.
example, on this we get exactly the same thing. So, and this is actually is good this one because we could check which experiments return the highest uncertainty and say, well, here we have no resolution. There could be, for example, points where there are holes. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah.
Oh, Ian's got a question. Great.
You had a slide called something like distribution of estimates, funding in the start of the talk. And probability distributions, keep going. Yeah, the one with the blue graphs on, that's it. That's the one, yeah. So your distributions extend quite substantially to negative pressures in some cases. And I didn't understand what that could possibly mean.
It's actually not. It's just the way this is done with a density. It should have been an histogram. So the histogram terminates. So there are no points on negative pressure. Sorry.
Okay.
It's just the way it's plot. It's plot with a density plot. So it needs to terminate somehow. But otherwise, we cannot have pressure below 1 atmosphere because there are no experiments performed below 1 atmosphere. So that's the.
Indeed.
Sorry, it's the, yeah. You see, to go back, sorry, but these distribution are very enlightening because you can see, I wouldn't trust too much a thing like this, yeah? With an estimate like this, I cannot do much really because the algorithm doesn't know, is it 10, is it 30 kilobar, is anything in between. So the idea is we just don't consider it because we find it not very informative as a constraint.
I have a question about the slide that you showed before where you had those two clusters of samples that were from slightly different depths and you knew that one was lower than the other cluster. Can you not leverage that knowledge somehow to improve the uncertainties? Can you not build that into your algorithm?
Sorry, I don't.
But you were saying that the uncertainty bars on the red points were much bigger than the uncertainty bars. Or that they overlapped compared to the uncertainty bars on the black points.
Yeah.
But you know that they're from different depths. I don't know how you said that. Can you not exploit that fact to improve the uncertainty estimates?
I'm not sure about the uncertainty estimate, but one thing that we do that goes in your direction and is reported in the paper of Colli Higgins. To convince ourselves, what we do is this sort of approach here. so you take your composition and you search the database. So we really search the database to find the composition of the pyroxene that is the closest possible to our. And then we look in a certain region of residuals. That means composition that are similar. And then we get distribution of pressure and temperature. So and ideally what we want, and it happens because random forest is doing that, is that the largest number of pressure at which these pyroxene were performed is similar to the pressure estimate we get from the random forest. So we did this exercise to convince ourselves that it was not a random number generator, because so we wanted to be sure. We said, but if you get 10 kilobar, the pyroxene that have the closest composition, they were synthesized at 10 kilobar too, and the answer is not all of them. So as Andy was saying before, the solution are non-unique. But if 80% were performed at 10 kilobar and the remaining 20% were performed at other pressure, random forest returns a value that is close to 10 kilobar, just because it's a majority of experiments that are similar to your composition that give the pressure. This is what it's doing. It's really flipping through the papers and finding the best match.
But it's not leveraging the fact that you might have constraints from the same sample, where you might know that one of them formed at a slightly lower pressure than the other one. For example, if you had a zone pyroxene, you would know that the outer zones formed at lower pressures than the inner zones.
Yes. So no, sorry. The textural thing we use. So we normally do profiles. We don't do points. Profiles are very important because sometimes you immediately identify a problem with growth rate. So there is an increase of growth rate, aluminum goes up, and then you see the pressure going 10, 10, 10, 20, and then it goes back to 10. So that tell us, I think, that you have some issues with the growth rate. It can be addressed. So you can add this to the information. If you do trace elements, for example, you will see that in this region where the composition is controlled by growth rate, then you start to get correlation between incompatible and compatible elements. An example for Bardarbunga was chromium and zirconium in some portion of the crystal were correlating perfectly. And so that was suggesting that depth pressure and temperature estimate you shouldn't use because it's not, the composition did not change because of pressure, it changed because of growth rate. So I guess I'm going around the question you're asking me, but there is way to integrate this, and especially important is to integrate good petrography and good analysis of the texture when you do this. You cannot just accept whatever comes out as a number. Otherwise, it's not very useful, I think.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions from in the room? Any more questions on the Zoom? Okay. Great. Well, let's thank Luca again for a really interesting talk. It was really cool. All right.
Thanks a lot it's more fun in presence, but
yeah, I'll leave the Zoom going for a little bit. If anybody wants to hang around and ask any questions, I'll also stop recording. Stop recording.